Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special episode recap for EdHeads. I'm joined by Bob Runcie, who's the CEO of Chiefs for Change. And the purpose of the episode recap just creates an opportunity for us to connect with people who are most proximate to the work, actual superintendents, district leaders who are doing the work to reflect on the themes we talk about in each one of these episodes. Bob is an equity warrior. He's served as a former superintendent at Broward County Public Schools and has a decorated career in education. And Bob, thank you so much for joining the show. And for the people who don't know you well, would you be willing to introduce yourself a little and share a little bit more about Chiefs for Change?
Bob Runcie, I'm the CEO for Chiefs for Change. Chiefs for Change is a nonpartisan organization. It's a network of innovative and bold leaders who serve as a catalyst for doing real innovative work on reimagining public education, with our North Star being getting every student access to improve outcomes on social and economic mobility by enabling the conditions for success from cradle to career.
Among the portfolio of things you're doing to encourage collaboration and to provide resources and support, most recently, you've started working with Teach AI to develop guidance for curriculum and policy and tools and assessments. Against the backdrop of emerging AI technologies and other technologies. And would you be willing to share a little bit more about that collaboration?
Teach AI has been was basically created and formed by organizations such as Code.org, the Educational Testing Service, ISTE, Khan Academy, World Economic Forum. There are also some technology industry leading partners there, such as Amazon, Cisco, Microsoft, and OpenAI. But there are also some of the major education organizations out there, such as the School Superintendent Association, CCSSO, National Association of School Boards, Council of Great City Schools, and of course, Chiefs for Change was one of those members as well. There's a great website that they have, teachai.org. You can find lots of resources on there. And I think a big one is ensuring that there's going to be access to AI for all kids. And one of the concerns I have is that unless we begin to take a systemic approach around this and ensuring that kids, especially in historically underserved communities, have access to the benefits of AI, that you're just going to widen a lot of the gaps, the opportunity gaps, and social and economic mobility gaps that exist today.
How have you been thinking about access? So what have those conversations been like? Is it just around like the pricing for these technologies? Is it part of that could be part of it? Another part could be kind of the digital divide. What are some of the things you're, advising your network on?
There needs to be also a shift in focus to say, hey, look, how are we thinking about how we can reimagine public education coming out of the pandemic? So we're not going back to where we were before, because those systems didn't serve all kids well either. And so I think trying to make sure that urban systems, poor systems, rural areas, that they're moving along at a pace and not falling behind schools in wealthier communities, private schools, et cetera. Just trying to make sure that we have a level playing field in terms of access to opportunities in technology. And obviously, AI is going to be a big game changer in the education space.
I appreciate all of that context, and there's so much we can dive into in each of those
Mhm.
areas.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's a perfect transition for some reflection on some of the episodes we've had, also notably with Aaron Moat, who's the CEO of Innovate EDU, and Dwayne
Mhm.
Matthews, who's the Chief Innovation Evangelist at Tomorrow Now
Okay.
Learning Labs.
So AI is an arrival technology. It is not going to be blockchain or Bitcoin or crypto. It is not a fad. It is here, and it has broken through the consumer consciousness in a way that we will not be able to pull it back.
Do you buy into this idea of that of AI being this arrival technology in the education space?
Yeah, I think that's partly true, but what I've seen in public education is that this is a industry that is heavily resistant to change and taking risks. So what happens with a lot of technology that ultimately gets infused and integrated into K-12, you see it's like this, it's the same processes and structures and forms, right? So, so we replace the chalkboard with a smart board, right? But it's still, for all intents and purposes, a lot of the way the school day structured, the schedules are put together, the way we organize staffing in schools, it's still the same. So I think that you have to focus a lot on the underlying systems and structures and processes, and you need to think about what opportunities does AI give you that you didn't have before to go and make those kind of changes to improve what you're already doing? I guess a short way of saying that is if you dump AI into the current structures and systems, what we have, I think you're going to get really outcomes that are more limited than what is possible. And it's going to vary literally from classroom to classroom, depending on where teachers are. The bottom line is our message to members is not to get caught up in the technology for technology's sake, and not to worry about the hype, but to take the time to understand their needs and the priorities of their districts, and then look to AI and say, how can we leverage AI to potentially provide solutions for meeting those needs based on our local context and the challenges that we see in front of us?
It was a very diplomatic answer. He said, maybe it's not quite BS, but you are encouraged by the possibilities with
Oh,
AI.
yeah.
And I mean, I think there's so much truth in what you're sharing, right? District leader is just inundated with all kinds of technology. And now, as you say, you're getting AI on top of it. So a common theme from one thing that Dwayne mentioned and what Aaron mentioned is this idea of interoperability. And then from Dwayne's perspective, he thinks it's important to where we get to a place where you see the seamless integration of these different platforms and technologies, similar to what you see the integration of Apple's products, for example.
So one of the key pieces of technology is when it becomes so embedded in your life that it feels like a part of your life. And so Apple spent a significant amount of time on continuity. So all of your devices work together. They create this relationship. It's really hard to break. And they've been very, very successful at that. In terms of education, the person that I can think of is the former director of education at the Toronto District School Board, a gentleman by the name of John Malloy. And he's now moved on to California. But he really took three basic principles and said to all the different schools, these are the three basic principles that we're going to focus on in terms of the protocols, how you want to interpret those principles. You can go ahead and do that. And it really created a movement.
And so from your perspective, what do you think is, how do you think we can get to that point from a district leader's perspective where you have true interoperability? What do you think is the first step in that direction where that can be true?
You've got to come up with some standards by which you dictate to the market and say, hey, look, if you want to do business with us, you need to make sure that your solution can fit into our environment and meet these interoperability standards that we put in place, because here's our platform. Because if you don't do that, you run the risk of having multiple solutions, multiple sign-ons, multiple security strategies, lots of integration things. It's super costly to maintain that. You create a lot of different risks as you've got data and information going across systems. And the maintenance and support costs for that is just significantly higher. It's just not what should be done. So I think districts need to really understand that you're the customer and leverage your position better. Taking that to another level, I think the opportunity is there for a critical mass of districts to come together and develop policies and guidelines and guardrails around AI that minimize the risk, but also maximize the benefits out of it. And I think that those guidelines should feed into procurement standards that they show and present to the vendor community. And I think the vendor community would appreciate the fact that there's some kind of framework that they can begin to structure their products and solutions towards.
One of the challenges right now, the development of these technologies is outpacing the research, right? And
Yeah.
so in order to be nimble to do things like learning the implications of how we can use these efficiently and effectively in a classroom will require us to do something different. And so you know Saga very well. We're very
Yeah.
passionate about, research and data. Erin, what the guest
I
is
know
pushing
Erin.
for,
Yep.
you know her well. She's pushing for legislation to increase R&D budgets at the U.S. Department of Education. And similar, Dwayne was making the call to empower districts to create their own innovation hubs where they can do this rapid cycle type of innovation, which requires a district leader to create that vision, that North Star about what do we want to accomplish. And similar to what you said, how can technology enable that? And do you actually believe it's really feasible and practical to create these types of innovation hubs within districts to put that R&D agenda in their hands? And if so, what would it take to get there?
But I think this is a great area for states to come in and provide some leadership, right? Because states can actually do this work and provide the frameworks, the spaces. They can provide funding to make sure that this happens. And so I would, suggest like our state superintendents associations, our state school boards association, that this become a platform, on their agenda for their state legislatures and their state departments of education to create these kinds of learning hubs and opportunities, so we can really begin. It's ironic, right? Well, public education is probably the worst at creating learning opportunities for itself. So we can figure
Yeah.
out how to get better at what we're doing. But yeah, I absolutely think that's probably the best case. It's one thing. Look, when the system's doing it on their own, they're going to be kind of limited to parochially like what everyone knows. But when you're able to work on a broader level with lots of different districts and systems, that is going to spur a lot of really great ideas and cross-pollination and things that folks have never really thought about. And I think that's the best way to accelerate the learning in this space.
So in other words, you like this idea of innovation hubs at a state level, not necessarily at individual district level.
Right. I'd like to see that at a state level, even regionally, but I think that's where the leadership needs to come into play. I mean, if it ain't happening there, like what's the purpose of the state education entities when it comes to AI? I think they can play a huge role. And this is one of those areas of opportunity for them.
And finally, in my discussion with Dwayne, he talked about, we went back and forth and talked about the promise of AI and personalization. And Dwayne also emphasized the fact that he believes education is always going to be human-led and technology augmented.
What that says to me is that there is a compelling component of being human that somehow we intrinsically know that we have to create human relations, whether they be shallow ones, deep ones, whether they just have people standing next to us. There's something in us that community is important. And I don't think that goes away. And I think AI gives us a moment of pause, right? We sort of got hit with a brick with social media. We didn't really see it coming. We didn't see all the techniques. But now there's not one country that I go to where people are not concerned about the impact of algorithmic nudging, the impact of variable interval scheduling in social media. And even young people are thinking, how do we get past this? And so I think this is a really good opportunity with AI for us to think about how do we take AI to actually make us more human? And historically, if we look at it, technology has actually allowed us to enhance our humanity.
From your own personal perspective, what do you think is the ideal use of AI in education? What does that really look like?
First of all, I agree absolutely that um, you can't replace the human side of learning, right? The relationships, the connections that students and teachers have. So you've got to be able to figure out, how do I fit AI into that kind of environment? But there are opportunities there, right? There's opportunities for personalization. Things like high dosage tutoring is a great example of that. It's very difficult for a teacher, and I'd say almost impossible, based on what I know, to have 25, 30 kids in classroom at different levels of understanding and trying to actually differentiate that just by themselves. If you can't have one or two other assistants in the classroom, it's going to be difficult to do. AI can potentially help to do that. So I think that's certainly one of the ways it can be done.
Um, Bob, I really appreciate your time and reflecting on some of these key themes from the episodes. I just really appreciate and admire all the work you've done in coordinating with these districts and look forward to continuing to learn what's possible leveraging these technologies.
Yeah, one thing I would leave on is and I kind of alluded to it at the front, is just the importance of focusing on change management, right? Being able to be very clear about, hey, why are we implementing this specific solution, leveraging AI this way? What are the outcomes? What's our vision around that? And being able to do that from the boardroom to the classroom, and ensuring that there's appropriate buy-in and understanding to this. That takes time. It takes good leadership. It takes great communication. So the whole change management around this, I think, is critical to successful AI implementation in systems.
Well, that actually brings us full circle. Right before we even kicked off this episode, the first thing you said right out of the gate is like, we have to find a way to empower families and students. And from a change management perspective, how do you think is the best way to really do that effectively from a district leader's perspective to get them involved in this R&D work, maybe getting them involved in how we're thinking about using these types of technologies with communities for communities?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the successful district leader now and into the future has to rethink their role. And I say that from the standpoint that the school system cannot solve all of these challenges by themselves, right? And again, as I mentioned to you earlier, our students are only in our school buildings maybe 20% of the time. The other 80%, they're in the community, they're in homes, families. So it's going to take an entire village approach to do that. And so I think bringing the community and interacting with them is going to be critical. Having community forums and conversations around the implications of AI in education, I think that's that's huge to put those kind of events on, because it not only educates the community about what you're doing and helps build their confidence in the fact that, hey, I'm putting my kids in a system that is forward thinking. They're going to get the best tools and technology out there, but it's also going to be done in a way that's safe and they're considering how to minimize the risk. The other part of it is, if you do this right, it's also a conversation for the community to start thinking about, well, geez, how do we leverage AI to improve our lives? How do we leverage AI to improve social, economic mobility outcomes in our community? So as we do that and improve community and families, we're creating better conditions for our kids when they show up to schools. So to your point, this conversation around AI should not be just limited to our education campuses. We, as education leaders and education systems, need to figure out how do we extend and connect those conversations to the broader community.
And Bob, I'm super grateful for your leadership there and carrying that mission, that vision. And I'm so grateful for Saga's work in supporting you along the way. And I appreciate your time. And I look forward to reconnecting with you, Bob.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining.
All right. Have a great day. Bye.
Follow us for more conversations with leading experts on AI next time on EdHeads.